All right, can everyone see my screen okay? Just give a thumbs up. All right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. Hi, everyone. I am Bethany Moody. I have been at Icon coming up on 9 years now, digging around in existing buildings at Icon. I work with an amazing group of really passionate, what I call modern preservationists. Happy to dive in and talk all about that. But today, we're going to focus on a few case studies, mostly, if you noticed in the title, the focus on historic schools. And we're going to look at existing building constraints and opportunities for creating these active senior housing communities. So existing buildings, they're usually built as a core of their communities, right? They were places of education, maybe worship, places of work. They're inherently central to their neighborhoods, and they're perfectly sited to support these active communities and people who want to age in place in their neighborhoods. A number of these particular case study projects that I'm going to talk about, Cody School probably completed few years back now, maybe 2017, but our Oxford school, Jonathan actually got that across the finish line. That was recently completed in 2022. And then a couple of these other case studies here are senior projects that are on the boards and beginning very shortly. The Athol School is going to be an exciting one for us. It's an intergenerational project, actually. But so when we're assessing a historic school for their reuse as housing, we're trying to help our clients determine what's feasible for their pro forma. So how many units can we get within the constraints of the historic building? Typically with a historic school, we're maintaining that existing circulation. Unit count is going to typically be dictated by the number and size of existing classrooms. Mix and layout of those units dictated by a number of things, but in my opinion, historic fenestration is going to be the leading factor. Where entries and egress points are, how are we achieving accessibility? What's our capacity for adding an elevator, or ideally at least two for senior housing? These are all the factors that we're starting to grapple with in helping our clients decide if this is a feasible project. But on top of that, how do we help them assess whether a historic school is a candidate for senior housing? So not all, but a majority of our adaptive reuse schools turned senior housing are also pursuing affordable housing tax credits. Regardless of whether or not they are pursuing that, the QAP checklist provides an excellent framework for addressing senior housing needs and universal design guidelines. For those not familiar, so DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, their QAP has Appendix L, the senior housing eval, and then there's Appendix J, this is the section Part B on universal design. And our goal here is to really demonstrate that we are trying to incorporate universal design features to improve function in the widest range possible for residents and to allow them to really age in place in their homes. And each checklist then breaks down features for exterior common areas. We have units, baths and kitchens, and the technology. And as much as I love historic buildings, I'm sure each of us that are working with existing buildings has our own battle wounds. Very often our goals in historic preservation are at odds with the senior housing requirements and accessibility and energy code. I'm teasing, but there is hope in the end. So another great resource that helps create this framework for us, Enterprise Green Communities has published their aging in place guidelines to provide best practice strategies that are going to allow individuals that flexibility and comfort to age in place and still remain a vibrant part of their community. And I'm a visual person. I love the infographics to kind of portray this in their book. They're giving this focus on the idea of connectivity and active living. So whether it's walkable, well-lit routes and access to transit or other neighborhood resources, covered or sheltered entries with places to wait for pickup, focus on visibility and access, providing active design with an emphasis on using stairs, but supporting this with elevators and ramps, allowing greater clearances, thoughtful consideration of finishes and lighting, things like grab accessories that will provide the support of a grab bar without looking institutional or like a nursing home. So really about preserving dignity for our seniors. So how do we get here when we're evaluating our beautiful historic property and we have to strategize who or what is the priority? When we look at our historic schools, it's first off the significant volumes of space. The corridors are this sacred nave of the historic school. This volume absolutely has to be preserved. The classroom volumes as well, if we're picturing standing at the entry of the classroom, the Park Service really wants to preserve this idea of seeing that full volume of that classroom. We don't want to be chopping up the space. It could also be significant spaces like gyms or stages and auditoriums. A number of other elements that really set the bones for our adaptive reuse projects are the historic window fenestration, preserving those openings, making sure that new walls are not encroaching on the casings, that obstructions are set back minimum 3 feet from openings to prevent any impact on sight lines from the exterior. Classroom door openings, right? We want to reuse what's there to the maximum extent possible. We really aren't trying to alter that movement through the sacred nave. And then there's the character defining fabric and features. So that looks like the historic stairs and cross corridor glazing. It could be the glass block or wainscoting and trim, chalkboards and chalk rails. A lot of focus lately on the floor finishes. Wood floors are a huge topic of late. So these are all elements that we're setting the stage for trying to determine what's going to stay and what we're going to protect. But I think the biggest point of emphasis that we can't forget is we're not creating museums. We're not preserving historic snapshots. As I said, we're modern preservationists. So we're respecting craft and heritage of the building. We're preserving unique character defining fabric. We are preserving that sense of place that's specific to that building, but then we're advocating for its opportunity to serve future residents and to meet what I like to think of as the spirit of the senior guidelines. So now to get into the good stuff. So this is an example project that at this point had been a few years old. It had received its Part 2 approval for historic tax credits and had been accruing these allocations, but now we were trying to align with the updated QAP that was issued in 2022. So this was just, if you look at the red underlay here, this is just the reality of the impacts of a now compliant bath and compliant kitchen option in red. The increased space requirements in the baths, we're looking at a 66-inch turning radius and wider curbless shower to allow for that space for residents and possible caregivers. The kitchens also have the larger turning radius and essentially a fully compliant kitchen with separate cooktops and wall ovens. And that's really making a significant impact on what would have been our living space in this unit. And we understood these requirements are improvements to allow for aging in place, but the function of the unit was seriously suffering by trying to meet these goals and work within the constraints of the historic fabric, right? We're dictated by the window locations and the millwork locations, the classroom entry, and just trying to be a unit that felt welcoming and felt functional and beautiful. These were just all kind of at odds with where we started. So we needed a new strategy to meet this spirit of senior guidelines as much as possible without sacrificing our original goal of that historic value. So we worked really closely with our DHCD reviewer at the time. It was a really thoughtful process. And we chose to prioritize increased clearances at unit baths. We thought that having the ability to have a caretaker or a spouse in there to assist a resident would really be advantageous for continuing to age in place. We also proposed modified accessible kitchens. So we couldn't incorporate that full 66-inch turning radius, but we did try to maximize to a 60-inch turning radius. We looked for other features like incorporating the removable bases, including drawer bases, giving multiple counter height options, and increasing visibility into those kitchen spaces so that the unit was as open as possible for caregivers to assist. Where we could at our larger units, like the larger 2 bedrooms, we did provide a fully accessible kitchen and really did not ask for waivers at those units. But at the smaller studios and one beds where it just was going to sacrifice the function of the unit, we came up with an alternate strategy for supporting it with a fully accessible community kitchen instead as part of our common area approach. Also with our historic entries, so we talked about those classroom entries on the sacred nave. We want to reuse these classroom entries. The doors and the fenestration we said are setting the bones for our unit layout. But let's be honest, the existing historic doors, they're beautiful, but they're not rated. The glass transom above, not rated, not providing any acoustic separation. Oftentimes, if this is an existing opening here or here, right, we're not getting our push-pull clearance, and maybe they're achieving a 32-inch clear when the door is removed. So what I think has been a really successful strategy on our school projects, I think it creates a really nice moment where we preserve the existing classroom opening on the corridor. Oftentimes we'll pin that classroom door open or remove it if needed. We'll maintain those transoms and those frames, but then we set back and create an anteroom with our rated entry door with our required push-pull clearances set into that space. And that's a nice moment to provide relief from the very active social corridor. It gives you the chance to step back and maybe provide those entry package shelves that are now in the QAP without protruding into the corridor. So I think this has really been a successful strategy that we have used. And this is just a look again at some of those strategies in our units. This is our recently completed Oxford School. So it was completed before it had to comply with the new QAP requirements, but we were still thinking forward about those universal design strategies and creating that visual connection into the kitchens from the rest of the living space, putting these multi-height kitchen surfaces to adapt to different function or different ability of residents. Really celebrating the natural light that can come into these spaces and working with the existing fabric, and again, choosing contrasting finishes to aid with visibility. And so this was just a glimpse at our case study project where we were trying to find a modified kitchen approach, right? And so this is that idea of, we created a central, fully accessible, shared community kitchen to address the fact that we just physically could not meet the requirements of Appendix L in each unit. And this was a great strategy that DHCD was willing to work with us on, because we also argued that this is encouraging social interaction. It's another opportunity to get seniors out of their units. It's got visual connection for anybody that's spending time in this space. And also just addressing some of the more common requirements from Appendix L and the senior guidelines. We understand laundry is truly a social hub. It's one of those activities that seniors are going to routinely come out of their units to participate in, right? But we're also trying to make sure that there's a variety of multi-purpose spaces around that, so that they have that visual connection into the laundry. And they also have the ability to breeze through if they don't want to have to engage and participate. We've learned that they tend to be a little cliquey and they need to socialize with the right group at the right time. And we're also looking for any opportunities to include smaller private meeting spaces, whether it's for visiting nurses, resident service coordinator. All of these are just finding those creative pockets to include in our common spaces. And we're finding that our schools typically have no issue in achieving all of the common area spaces. But this is the moment that we really need to celebrate. No one is designing or building inefficiencies into new construction, but these are the exact moments where the preservation of historic buildings is intersecting with the needs of an active senior community. If you think back to middle school, right, you're not just milling about in the corridors. The school corridors are the place of socializing. And that's the spirit that we need to hold on to and preserve along with the rest of the historic fabric. And so we take advantage of that in our historic schools. We've got these wide corridors. These are our opportunities to pull seniors out and have them participate in their street, in their neighborhood. we follow the idea that is laid out in the enterprise green guidelines and locate these little pockets of social space on each floor. And we are setting these as quiet stop libraries, as soft seating, lounge nooks. On one level where we've kind of dubbed it as our lobby space, we've introduced our mail and our coffee bar locations. And it's placing these frequently used services on each floor, encouraging residents to come out of their home, ideally reducing travel distance so they're not having to walk all the way to the central amenity space or the clubhouse. And this is just an important reason why historic schools are so uniquely suited to support vibrant housing. And just one more note on that, often these historically significant spaces are not useful for a client's pro forma. They're not able to be used for unit count, but that is the point that I want to drive home, that the success of these projects is really in these spaces. These inefficient pockets are what are actually supporting the Aging in Place program. It's found space that can get residents out of their homes and interacting. And we're just not going to build these kinds of quality spaces as new construction. So I would be remiss in an existing building presentation if I didn't talk about historic fenestration and all of those challenges. Appendix L states that windows should be awning style for seniors, but we do get that clause for historic. We're usually, if we're a candidate for replacement windows, we can provide the single hung simulated windows, and we know manufacturers will be able to meet those opening force requirements to comply with ADA. When we have a case where historic is stipulating that windows have to be rehabbed, our window restoration groups, they advocate that a properly balanced hung window should provide that minimum force requirement, but we are also trying to strategize on this point as well. We're exploring a sort of kit of parts for what we think needs to go into all of our restoration window scope. We're looking at operable energy storms. They have performance panels that include insect screens. Ideally, those energy storms would be interior installed from both a historic perspective and operability perspective. We're investigating sash lift assist hardware that would actually be installed in that jam pocket and help to alleviate the weight of the sash. And then in a number of cases, we're installing physical hardware onto the sash itself to really help with that operability and assist seniors. So moving to the outside of the building and looking at the site, a number of issues we run into, or opportunities that we run into, is working with the constraints of the existing entries and access. A lot of times we're trying to strike a balance between preserving the historic entry and then repositioning a new primary entry that would be most equitable for the population. So this is a case where this is our Salem School project. The historic entry is actually here on Federal Street, and we do need to maintain it for historic purposes. It is actually providing an accessible connection on Federal Street, but it's also just not visually helpful in terms of wayfinding, and the access is pretty limited as far as getting allowing for aging in place and getting a senior in and out in a comfortable fashion. So this was kind of our opportunity to review the site in a greater context and make a case for this new equitable primary entry while still maintaining the historic entry. So in this case, we, I don't know if you noticed, but we have some severe grading that we're challenged with, but we actually proposed to historic that we wanted to create a new primary entry for the project that actually is built off of the Bridge Street parking lot. And we thought we made a great case for this because not only do we maintain the historic connection to downtown, but now we're providing via a landscaped corridor connections to an incoming senior center, connections to the local transit of the neighborhood. We are developing as part of this reuse of this really large paved lot, creating these pockets of outdoor amenity with seating, shading, again, wayfinding wayfinding and lighting, and creating these other pockets of outdoor amenity and activity. We also, again, try to be creative. We can't build out a new vestibule that would be protected, but since we have this opportunity to create a new entry, we've developed a zero curb entry point for pickup and drop off. We've been able to introduce a covered awning that wouldn't have been appropriate at the front entry up there. And we're also able to create a carved out interior pocket that still keeps eyes on that primary entry. And so this was a successful opportunity of being able to maintain the historic entry in that use, but also create a more equitable primary entry without affecting the historic fabric. And I think the other emphasis on this is that those reprogrammed accessible routes, they're not meant to be secondary and they're not back of house, but they're creating these unique spaces that wouldn't otherwise be offered. And we're trying to encourage seniors to venture outdoors and give them these moments of rest along their path, give them some additional opportunities to connect outside. And definitely there's tons of conversation about the different types of recreational activities that we should provide for seniors. And I think I'm just going to leave with this last story. This is our Cody School project in Bourne. It was a former middle school, and there was clearly a ton of love for this school. All through the job, neighbors were stopping by. They wanted to bring home water fountains and whatever they could have. And we finished the job, and it's beautiful, and we got the part 3. And if you know what a major feat that can be. But the best part of it that I absolutely loved was that many of the seniors who moved in here actually used to be students here. So this is our passion as modern preservationists at Icon. We're seeing buildings as resources for housing and for climate change and social services. But in the case of senior housing, we see existing buildings as preserving independence for aging in place. So that's all I have for you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Stop share.
Thank you, Bethany.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was great.
Thanks, Jonathan.
I have a few questions, but I want to say, or discussion points, because or pain points when we do historic buildings, but I want to see if anyone in the audience has some
Love some shared
questions
pain.
before. Yes.
Yeah, I have a couple points too. Well, let me begin by asking one, Bethany. You talked about, obviously, you referenced historic. You're talking about historic tax credits typically, although as we know, these projects don't necessarily pursue historic tax credits. There might be other groups, just like local historic groups, or that can help procure funding, like CPA funds. Can you just talk a little bit more about the restraints or constraints associated with historic and how you sort of navigate that? And I guess maybe I don't know if there are occasions where there is no specific historic body that's regulating anything.
I mean, it might be, I haven't in my project specifically not had a body, whether it was a local historic or larger. If you're pursuing tax credits, then obviously it'll be a different story. But I guess navigating constraints, if we look specifically, if we talk about trying to pursue a part 2 and looking at amendments, there's always going to be an amendment process. I feel like when we talk to our clients, we're trying to make sure it's achieving first and foremost their program goals. We're advising them, because if they're pursuing historic tax credits, in working with a historic building, we owe it to the building, and we need to ensure that they can get to that goal. But I think first and foremost, we have to make sure that it's solving the need for the new population. And it's almost better to go in asking for what you need and finding amendment opportunities as needed if we have to go back. But it's really just this delicate dance. And I think it's better to start with what you really need to satisfy your program and within reason.
Do we ever feel that the constraints put upon the building or the development of the new use are too overwhelming to, you know, I hate to say it, but they cause a financial burden on the project that makes it impossible?
Nothing's impossible.
Nothing's impossible.
Um, yeah, I think it's been kind of it's a double-edged sword. It's I've appreciated that it seems like the powers that be at MHC and NPS have been willing to have conversations, it seems, and have these kind of preliminary calls. It seems like the landscape is kind of always changing depending on who's involved. But I think usually we've come up against some situations where it really has been a financial, like if it's a structural concern that we're at in the change of use, we have come up in some dire situations, and it's been trying to make your case that you've left no stone unturned. This is the concern that will actually impact the historic fabric, and we've tried to resolve it, and just doing that due diligence. I think the same comes up when we talk about dealing with the energy code. I mean, we're constantly at odds with insulating, right, our exterior walls, and then not maybe being able to satisfy the stretch code requirements, right? I think it's just kind of a constant dialogue between a lot of different groups, and hopefully we land on compromise.
Compromise is definitely something we address a lot in these buildings. One image caught my eye, Bethany, in particular, is the last one where I think I saw either carpet or something else that is soft.
Yeah.
And acoustics is usually the most challenging things in schools, and one of the most important things for seniors. So how did you end up with carpet there, which is great for acoustics, but it is not historic? And then I'm curious to see how, if you or if anybody who's done adaptive reuse, how has been their success in introducing any acoustic materials into those spaces, especially the corridors? That becomes very echoey, and when the corridors are large and you put seating, then you have conversations, but it is echoey and it's just not conducive for conversations. So I love the fact that you were able to have a carpet here. So tell me about it.
Probably won't be replicated many more times. So at least in this example, it was, I want to say that this was a little maybe more old guard. It was done in 2017. So I think my projects lately have fortunately, unfortunately, been having wood floors, and they have to be maintained. And so, and it gives me concern, because I am starting to see engineered wood floors installed in projects, and it's echoey. And I think even we're trying to do a better job of studying that that acoustic floor underlayment assembly that's going on top of our structure, with a sound reduction board, gypcrete, and another sound mat on top of that. If we have existing wood floors that we have to protect and maintain, it's a totally different beast. And I don't know that we have it totally studied enough yet. I'd be curious to see what others are doing. We're looking at using spring isolation below existing framing, adding a second layer of drywall on the ceiling, filling the stud cavities with acoustic bat. But I do think that the wood floor challenge is going to keep rearing its head. I'd love to hear what others are doing.
Yeah, for those who don't do adaptive reuse, a ceiling tile is a no-no for the historic people. So
Yeah.
But there are ceilings that look exactly like gyp that are acoustically rated. So.
And
like
sometimes, correct me if I'm wrong, sometimes historic will kind of bless a material that's diametrically opposed to what was there, right? In an effort to just acknowledge that it's not going to be that anymore. Like, so you're not putting wood look LVT down on top of old hardwood, right?
Yeah, that's been actually, I feel like this is one of those cases where I said the landscape's evolving because we've been
Mhm.
able to, at one project, use non-wood look LV, specifically
Yeah.
non-wood look LVT, and we can put down like a nice beefy 20 mil product, and it has an acoustic backing on it, and it's very helpful.
It
But
can have
then,
a wood appearance.
but no
But
wood
that's
appearance.
when you don't have existing terrazzo or existing wood that
Exactly.
has to remain, right?
Exactly.
When you
Yeah.
have a corridor that is in bad shape, then
Right.
you could do these things. Um,
It's
yeah,
a huge
it's a
problem.
challenge. I was told that the acoustical echo is what needs to be preserved in those rooms. So
Oh,
it
that's
is a
what you were telling
quality,
me.
but it's a quality that doesn't work for the population you're trying to serve.
Yeah, and I guess that's where we're going to have to find some other strategy. I mean, right, we're not adding acoustic panels to the walls maybe, but like we introduced in one space, we introduced acoustic felt light fixtures, right, to help absorb sound. And maybe when we have these opportunities to introduce soft seat, like
Yeah.
finding these places to introduce upholstery and soft absorbent surfaces,
Yeah.
rugs where we can.
There's also acoustical art,
Acoustic art.
artwork that
Ooh.
not sure I love, but they're
Jonathan, we might have to get interiors to look at that.
That is what, absorptive? That has like a cushy
yes.
mixed media kind of art.
No, they from far away they look like posters or kind of canvases, but when you get close, you see that something is too fuzzy.
Mm,
So yeah, we used them in one project actually.
yeah.
Interesting.
But the products that are for ceilings that really do look like gyp and are panels that are grouped together and taped, and they don't look like panels at all, but they have acoustical rating.
Yeah.
Like I think it's called Acoustic Build from Armstrong is one of them. So I have another
Thank you, Ruth.
and that is kind of the how do all the program ideas actually get used in the real world, and kind of the thing that I looked at was that solution of having a nice, accessible, accessorized, well-equipped kitchen on the floor. And I don't know how long the place has been open or whether you have experience with this solution in other buildings, but how often is it used? How often would somebody say, okay, I'm going to schlep all my ingredients and my cookbook and come and cook a meal in a common kitchen because I don't have everything I need in my unit?
I would say I'm curious what others' experiences might be. I would say that most often what we're hearing is that it's when they're hosting friends or having family and it's almost like rentable space where they want to be able to prepare a larger meal, and so they're having it's more of an event and a gathering and getting together, and not so much like a nightly prep of their meals. But that was the other argument too in talking to some stakeholders, that they're like, I don't need this wall oven, this separate wall oven in my unit. I would rather have cabinet space or additional place to have a chair, like it's kind of trying to understanding that it is serving and what the greater spirit of it is, but it may not always be practical.
Yeah, and I'm the wrong person to even ask about it because I keep saying that most important appliance in my kitchen is the phone, but but I have visited, walked through a lot of projects and occupied buildings where nooks were not used, little lounges on the floors, nobody sat there, unless there was somebody that actually said, hey, at 4 p.m. this afternoon, we're going to have a tournament of this and that in that lounge. So maybe that would get people to go, but kind of occasional use of, hey, there's a lounge here, why don't I sit? In my experience, really happens very rarely.
So really looking at specific program, and that's where when we have different CDCs, they're really engaging a resident services coordinator who is trying to create that scheduled programming and use those spaces.
Ruth, you bring up an important point. I'll add a place with natural light, because when we put chairs in a corridor without natural light, it's really not a place where people will congregate based on our experience. I think Sarah has her hand raised.
Yes, I do. Thank you. I'm so glad that you guys are doing this, honestly, because I mean, New England is full of all these buildings that we wish we had all the money to retrofit into this exact type of market, right? Especially with everyone, you know, especially with this large population of people that, you know, move to the suburbs for different school districts and now don't want to live in a big house, right? But they don't want to move into a facility that honestly makes them want to die a little faster. I hate to say it, like some of these are pretty awful, right? So but on the side of the preservation portion of this, so I was lucky to work at a firm that did historic preservation for 6 years, and I did work with DHCD for a while, and so I do have a question that, you know, DHCD kind of hurts me personally when, you know, they haven't really updated their material standards and their sustainability standards and that sort of thing. And you know, I saw in some of the pictures, you know, the luxury vinyl tile against beautiful millwork, right? Or a laminate countertop up against this beautiful space. And it's just kind of such a clash, but also when it comes to the fact that these buildings are outlasting modern buildings that we're building today. You know, how can you guys and how can we as an industry put materials in that are going to actually last, especially with how much maintenance, I mean, especially when you have caretakers in there, there's a lot of cleaning, there's a lot of, you know, assisted movement devices that hit walls and hit cabinetry and that sort of thing. So I'm just trying to think about, like, how can we make these spaces, you know, really sort of match the beauty of a lot of these old buildings, while also thinking about the fact that if we put in like a laminate countertop or a vinyl tile, you know, luxury vinyl tile flooring, you know, the building's going to outlast that, right? So how can we put in something that's durable, that's also gonna meet the, I don't know, the feel of the different spaces?
And I would say, I mean, so others feel free to chime in. I do think a lot of this is just revolving around the conversations we have with our clients and what they're comfortable with. We're definitely seeing a lot more willingness to explore the life cycle of the products that they're putting in. We're definitely seeing not just a look at the first cost, but can we explore the quartz countertops that are really going to stand up longer and people are going to be proud of those and take care of those, and it's going to be maintained much longer. Where I think those conversations are being had more and more with our clients, and I think it's just also our responsibility to bring them those options. I mean, the materials, there's constantly more that's being offered that I think a lot of clients just aren't aware of and are learning. But I would love to hear what others have to say.
Bethany, Sarah, I can add maybe a little bit. I think what the historic bodies want us to do is not replicate what is there when what was there no longer exists.
Mhm.
So if there's a damaged wood floor, in the guidelines of National Park Services, it says you want to put a material that is not a copy. They don't want to confuse between what's old and what's new. Now, sometimes they make exceptions because they think that this one thing has to be replaced in kind. But in majority, the requirement, Bethany, is, as you showed it in your photos, that where there is a new material, it wants to look like it's a new material.
Mhm.
And the which to me seems very respectful of the history. We just have to make sure that that new material is complementary, not a copy, but complementary. What I was going to say. In terms of new and old, also, it's our clients who look for durability or can't afford certain materials. The historic folks, most times, want us ideally to dismantle the new 20, 30 years later, if the building theoretically needs to go back to its original state. So the durability of materials is, I don't think it's very high on their priority. It's more on the aesthetic. They're more focused on the aesthetic look of the materials and how it doesn't copy the historic fabric. That's how I've been approaching.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Whether the building is going to be dismantled again, the new things, and then it's never going to go back to a school, right? But they want to leave this possibility where things could backtrack.
Mhm.
Bethany, Bethany, I wanted to talk a little bit about scale. You spoke really eloquently about fenestration, and then you also mentioned that oftentimes with historic schools, at least, and there are other typologies of buildings that are being historically adapted in FLEEP. I know we want to think about maybe a series of this, but you mentioned that classrooms are oftentimes translatable to a residential unit in their size. Maybe not. Maybe sometimes you end up carving them up. I think it's just interesting, and how does one deal with when the scale's off? Sometimes the windows are absolutely enormous and are impractical for a residential unit, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges there?
I guess probably sometimes the rhythm of the fenestration is not quite in sync with, like, consider a DHCD standard bedroom, like it has to be 10 by 10 as the secondary, right? Like, sometimes that's not aligning with existing fenestration, and then you end up with you try and work with the fabric that you have, but you have to respect that you can't encroach on that opening, and it has to set back. I think a lot of the guideline there, and I've done a few kind of preliminary calls with the Park Service, and they've wanted to see 3D views of our Revit model of, I'm standing at the classroom entry, what am I going to see when I'm looking into the classroom? And I want to be able to see what that volume looks like. So that starts to, I think, start layout. If that's truly the guide, we need to keep that living space prioritized as you're coming into that space so that you can see across and see into that fenestration. I think the other end of it is, I mean, you're trying to work with the fabric. So if you've got built-in millwork that, right, we've got projects right now that we're talking about the sliding chalkboards and old millwork that has to be retained, but we're not going to keep that in a bathroom, right? So we have to, even if our standard unit module that we might begin with fits into that space, it doesn't necessarily land that way, and maybe a bathroom gets put in a a unique place because it can't have a millwork in it. I think it's kind of, I think you can't be wed to the fixed module.
I'm curious, a question to everyone who does adaptive reuse. Is there a typology of historic building that we think is more appropriate for senior housing than another? Sarah, you mentioned we have so many old buildings in Massachusetts. Some of them are mills, some of them are storages, some of them are schools. Some of them actually are modern mid-century schools. Unfortunately, they don't get the same attention as the historic schools, even though some of them qualify as historic because they're more than, I think, 70-year-old is the cut
50,
line,
I think, is a
50 or
50
70.
years. Yep.
So
50
yeah,
years.
so they are historic. I'm curious to see if anybody thinks anything's more appropriate.
Seems like if something kind of has repetitive spaces along corridors, that kind of naturally lends itself unless the repetition and the structure is in your way. So that's, but there was a time where people were talking about shopping malls turning into senior living.
There still are. There still are people that are talking about taking shopping malls and retrofitting them to, I think there's one in Rhode Island, Connecticut. There's a historic one that they used the upper floor as the colonnade is the spot where everyone enters their units, and then the first floor is more retail and things to actually bring people, you know, around. But yeah, there's a lot of massive shopping malls that people are thinking of using deconstruction. So breaking down the masses of these giant buildings that, you know, you were never meant to see sunlight in, right? Except for, you know, in the circulation paths or the eating area. But they take up so much space, and there's so many of them that are starting to be closed. And, you know, depending on the materials that are in there, really just it will tell you whether or not you can use it, right? Because if a shopping mall is built with all this, you know, hazardous materials, what's the remediation cost before you even get the project started, right? So I don't know, it tends to, the buildings that tend to be like the mills and the brick schools tend to, I don't know, they tend to, from my experience, tend to have a lot less of those than the more modern stuff. But I'm sure everyone's seen some schools that have been retrofitted and have PCBs on the windows and, you know, asbestos tile that's been laid down, that sort of thing.
I guess I would say, at least in all the projects I've worked in, they've needed to be totally 100% abated.
Abated, like they would have
Hazardous materials?
yeah.
Yeah. The 9x9 tiles, hot joint compound, hot window caulking, lead paint all throughout. Yeah.
So what do people do? They remove the historic fabric and put it back?
Yeah. So like, for example, at the schools, like when we have windows that have to be rehabbed and they usually are hot and need to be fully abated, it's a pretty thorough process where they're documenting the window where it is currently located. They remove it off site, they dip it, they bring it back in, and they document that it's put back in the location it was removed. They do the lead spot to confirm that it's not hot any longer. Same goes for a lot of the millwork as well. Now, my understanding is that if it's not something that would be operable. Like if you're just going to have millwork that's going to be maintained in place, then it's not considered a friction surface. And that is something where you could just, if it's not flaking, you could just repaint and follow lead safe work practice. But the concern is when something like a door or a window that's going to be friction, that's when you have the issue.
And needless to say that adaptive reuse is not necessarily less expensive than building new, but I think the payback or the emotional payback is significant for communities.
Yeah, the going full circle, that people that went to school there now live there, that's
Yeah.
performing. So,
And just, I mean, we have an in-house sustain team that's doing a lot of research on just even modeling the carbon, embodied carbon of these buildings and trying to understand the amount that's been saved by preserving the structure, avoiding the demo, avoiding the bringing in new materials. We've been trying to study if we tried to build this brand new from scratch, which would never happen. What that looks like. It's not cheaper, but there's a lot to be said for.
Yeah. Anything else from anyone? Bethany, do you have anything to close?
I can't wait for you to host the part 2 of Mills or maybe Sarah will come do shopping malls.
Yeah, let's. I mean,
I've
we're
never
looking.
done one, but it's interesting.
We
There's
want to
project
think
back
about
home that is
adaptive.
thinking about doing it.
We'll have to
We
find
want to
something.
think about adaptive reuse for senior housing of different types of buildings. I think you guys do a lot of schools. We do a lot of schools at the Mela Schaefer. It seems like it's a typology, I think, because of their location, but they're mills too. That's why my question is like, is there a better typology? But if anybody here in the audience has an idea about, or somebody who's working on an adaptive reuse of a different typology, let me or Jonathan know, and then we can think about how to put together a part 2 presentation. It'll be great.
yeah, the downside of all these spaces along a corridor is the solution is linear. And sometimes a better or more interesting or more socially invigorating topology is not along a line. So those corridors, as you characterize them as the nave, what do you do with all the lockers? You keep them as
We keep them. Yeah. Well, I think in this last photo, right, we tried to keep as much as, right, it's just, I love talking about it, but we tried to keep as much of these little anecdotes throughout the building. So once we cleaned up the lockers, most of them we fixed closed, but if they had a really special message left behind, we wanted to make sure that that wasn't forgotten, so.
I mean, we have a project, Bethany, where we had original 1930s slate chalkboards in a classroom, and now they're in someone's kitchen and they can write their grocery list on them.
Right.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I think they make great buildings, to live in, but adaptive reuse. Every unit is different. You never do typical unit, right? You always have just floor plans.
Well, but Ruth, to your point too, so if we're talking about typologies, a mill building is going to have much more linear, endless circulation, at least a school footprint, depending on the style or year. It's going to have maybe a shorter nave.
Yeah. Well, the length that you mentioned, Ruth, reminds me that wayfinding gets very tricky and confusing in schools because of the length of the corridor, but also because of the door that opens versus the door that is shut, right? It's the strategy of preserving the doors along the corridor, whether they are useful or not. It adds to that confusing wayfinding that we have to think about as architects as we address adaptive reuse.
And in
I saw
sorry.
I saw one photo where one of the doors was pinned on the wall.
Yeah,
Right, it's the inoperable door, and then you have
Yeah.
an operable door next to it. How you differentiate these from each other?
right.
And old schools, they didn't think about bringing daylight into corridors. So I think modern schools are a lot more, architecture is a lot more sensitive to daylight, especially when a corridor is a social area. So
Mhm.
Actually, we have a school we're doing, Ruth, which has transom lights, glass, from the classroom to the corridor, which is the worst because it's a nightmare to fire rate and preserve cost.
Mhm.
So I'm kind of glad they didn't bring natural light into the corridor, because how do you do all this?
Which
Unless
I
it's an
mean,
outside window. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah,
correct.
and I mean, which is why, so we have, often we're preserving the existing stairs, which do have windows, and then the cross corridor glazing is there, which is another battle, right, to
Yeah,
preserve
yeah.
that glazing, and address fire protection, but that is
That's
an
right.
opportunity to bring in light into those spaces.
Yeah, yeah.
That we couldn't do today.
To Ruth's point about wayfinding, I am curious about what sort of typologies would be sort of easy to make that easier for the residents. Just because, you know, mill buildings, that can, just the corridors are super long unless you like take a whole mill, like one building, break it in half and have 2 circulation cores, for example. That makes it, you know, a little bit easier. But, you know, a lot of these senior living sort of places that they don't always think about like seating in the hallways, because you always have these people, they, you know, in these existing buildings, you're walking such a long way, right? You know, depending on how to get to your unit. And even if it's just like, you know, 50, 60 feet, some people just are really going to need to sit down, you know,
Yeah.
as part of the aging in place process, right? And with wayfinding in some of these old buildings, as much as I love running around all these mill buildings, going up 3 steps to go to a separate section of the building and down 2 others to get to another section, it can be, it's a huge design challenge with this specific population. Yeah, it's just like, you're looking at these buildings, thinking about, you know, how can you do the units in a way that's going to break down the scale of circulation so that, you know, people aren't having to tackle that, you know, on top of just daily things that they do. So
Color is not something that the Historic Commission weigh in much on. So I don't know how you guys use color, but we use color as a wayfinding. When something is painted, historically, you can paint it whatever color you want. But when something is stained, it has to stay stained. So we end up with colored doors on different floors or different wings if the school is big, and this becomes part of our wayfinding.
Yeah, I would say that that's usually the path we take too.
or artwork, like themes in
Yeah,
art.
absolutely. Yeah. But usually when it's affordable housing, then our budget never makes it to art.
That's true.
Cool. Yes, Gabrielle, I'll put back the link. And please, those who have not entered their credentials for AIA credit, do so in the Google Doc that I just put in. Great.
Now, Philippe, just before we close, is there an interest of kind of a subgroup or something like that to talk about the FGI? And if whether we want to maybe submit something as a group?
It will be good. Yes, we have a month and a half.
Yeah.
Like June 30th, the window closes for that.
Right.
I am part of the revisions committee for the residential healthcare group.
Yeah.
So I'm working with the FGI group to do some of that, but I could make myself available if people are interested or have questions about how to enter a proposal, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. If people are interested, yeah, let me know, Ruth. We're doing a good amount of changes for the next revision. Because as you probably know, it's the second edition. The 2022 is the second edition that's come out, and it has a good amount of holes that we would.
This is the residential and long-term care, right?
This is the residential healthcare, yes, that addresses skilled nursing, assisted living, and adult day. Yeah,
So
not the
that-
hospital or the outpatient, just the assisted living, skilled nursing.
So if I could be helpful, that would be the portion that I could be helpful on. So
Okay.
if there's anything that,
If you have anything in mind
no, I
that
don't.
you have been struggling with the codes and you think it doesn't make sense, let's talk. Yeah.
The one thing that is kind of challenging with the FGI is the jumping back and forth and the reference. But I don't have another solution to, you know, instead of repeating that is kind of a more efficient way, but
That's right.
going through something and then the number of times you have to zigzag is usually
It's exhausting. It's difficult, yes. But this is the structure that all the 3 books have been having, and that's how it is. Yeah.
okay.
Cool.
Good.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. For Jonathan, anything else you want to add? We
No,
can close?
thank you all. Keep me
Okay.
posted on the FGI. I'm not familiar with it, just from where I come from in my background, but happy to get
Okay.
involved.
Cool.
And
Thank you,
we'll see you all in July. Will be our next session, correct?
Do we have
Yes.
time for that?
What's that?
We don't have a topic yet. We
Okay.
should. We're open to topics. The
Absolutely.
co-chairs are not supposed to only be the one generating the entertainment. So
Yeah.
any suggestions is very much welcome.
Yes.
Times it feels like being
Yes.
the producer of a show.
I know.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Thank
Thank
you,
you all.
Bethany, very much for your time.
Thanks, Bethany.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.